What would happen if the darkest wizard of all time experienced the one emotion he never understood? What if Lord Voldemort, the man who split his soul into 7 pieces, who murdered countless innocents, who terrorized the wizarding world for decades, what if he fell in love? This isn't just a romantic what-if scenario. This is a question that strikes at the very heart of who Voldemort is, and more importantly, who he could have been. Before we dive into this fascinating hypothetical, we need to understand something crucial about Tom Riddle, the boy who would become Voldemort. His entire existence was built on a foundation of lovelessness. And I don't mean that metaphorically. According to J.K. Rowling's own words, Voldemort was conceived while his father was under the effects of a love potion. His mother, Merope Gaunt, used magic to make Tom Riddle Sr. fall for her. When she stopped giving him the potion, hoping he'd grown to love her naturally, he abandoned her immediately. She died shortly after giving birth, and Tom Marvolo Riddle entered the world as a boy who was literally incapable of understanding love. Now, some might argue this is just symbolic, but Rowling has been quite clear about this. Voldemort's inability to love isn't a character flaw he chose. It's baked into his very existence. He can't feel it. He doesn't understand it. And throughout the entire Harry Potter series, this becomes his greatest weakness. Love is the magic he cannot comprehend, cannot predict, and ultimately cannot defeat. It's why Lily Potter's sacrifice protected Harry. It's why Harry survived. Love is the antithesis of everything Voldemort represents. So what happens if we change that fundamental aspect of his character? What if somehow Tom Riddle or Lord Voldemort developed the capacity to feel genuine romantic love? Not obsession, not possession, not the desire to own someone, but actual love with all its vulnerability, selflessness, and transformative power. This is where our story gets really interesting. Let's start with the psychology of it all. Imagine you're Voldemort. You've spent your entire life believing that love is weakness, that attachment is foolishness, that the only thing that matters is power. You've built an entire philosophy around this. You've murdered to achieve immortality. You've torn your soul apart to escape death. You've gathered followers through fear and promises of power. Everything you are is constructed on the belief that love is for fools, and then suddenly, inexplicably, you feel it. What would that do to someone? The first reaction would likely be denial. Voldemort would probably interpret these feelings as something else entirely. Perhaps he'd think he was being cursed or that someone had slipped him a love potion. Oh, the irony. He'd probably try to legitimize himself, search his own mind for signs of magical interference. He spent decades mastering occlumency, building walls in his mind, and now there are feelings breaking through those walls that he doesn't recognize and can't control. For someone who prizes control above everything, this would be absolutely terrifying. But let's say these feelings persist. Let's say that despite his best efforts to rationalize them away, to suppress them, to understand them as anything other than what they are, Voldemort realizes he's experiencing love. The psychological crisis this would create cannot be overstated. His entire identity would be called into question. If he can love, then what does that mean about all his theories? What does it mean about the choices he's made? What does it mean about the soul he's destroyed? Here's where it gets even more complicated. Voldemort has created Horcruxes. He's split his soul into 7 pieces through acts of murder. Each Horcrux represents a fragment of who he once was, locked away in an object, keeping him tethered to life, but also keeping him from being whole. In the books, Dumbledore suggests that Voldemort has damaged his soul beyond repair, that he's become less than human. But what if love could start to heal that damage? There's a fascinating magical principle at play here. In the Harry Potter universe, love is described as the most powerful magic of all. It can create protections that dark magic cannot penetrate. It can leave marks on people that last for years. When Harry's mother died to save him, her love literally lived in his blood, in his skin. It became a shield that Voldemort couldn't break. So if Voldemort, with his fractured soul and his darkened heart, somehow began to love, would that start to repair the damage he'd done to himself? Think about what creating a Horcrux requires. You have to commit murder, an act so evil that it tears your soul. But what if love works in the opposite direction? What if genuine, selfless love could begin to knit those pieces back together? Voldemort might find himself in a situation where, for the first time in decades, he feels more whole, more human, more like Tom Riddle than the Dark Lord. And that would absolutely terrify him. Because here's the thing about love. It requires vulnerability. It requires you to care about something more than yourself. It requires you to accept that there's someone whose happiness and safety matter as much as, or maybe even more than, your own. For Voldemort, whose entire existence has been about self-preservation, about achieving immortality, about putting himself above everyone and everything, this would be completely antithetical to everything he's worked toward. Imagine Voldemort lying awake, and yes, he does need to sleep in his physical form, thinking about this person he's fallen for. He'd be running through scenarios in his mind. What if they're hurt? What if they're used against him? What if his enemies discover this weakness? Because that's what he'd see it as initially, a weakness, a vulnerability, a crack in his armor. Every Dark Lord knows that caring about someone gives your enemies a target. He's probably used loved ones against his victims countless times. He understands the tactical disadvantage of emotional attachment. But then there'd be the other thoughts, the ones he doesn't want to acknowledge. What if this person makes him feel something he's never felt before? What if, for the first time in his entire existence, he experiences a moment of genuine happiness that isn't tied to power or victory or watching his enemies suffer? What if love feels good? That might be the most dangerous realization of all, because if love can make him happy, if it can fill some void he didn't even know existed, then what does that say about the path he's chosen? Now let's talk about how this would affect his behavior and his plans. Voldemort's entire strategy has always been about accumulating power and eliminating threats. He doesn't form genuine alliances. He doesn't have friends. He has servants, followers, useful tools. Even his most loyal Death Eaters, people like Bellatrix who worship him, are kept at arm's length. He trusts no one because trust is vulnerability, and vulnerability is death. But if he loves someone, really loves them, everything changes. First, his priorities would shift, even if he didn't want them to. Let's say he's in the middle of planning an attack on the Ministry of Magic or hunting down Harry Potter, and suddenly he receives word that the person he loves is in danger. What does he do? The old Voldemort would consider it a distraction, maybe even let them die to prove to himself that he's still in control, that he hasn't gone soft. But if he genuinely loves this person, could he really make that choice? Or would he find himself apparating to their location, abandoning his carefully laid plans, prioritizing their safety over his goals? This would not go unnoticed by his Death Eaters. The Death Eaters follow Voldemort because he's powerful, because he's ruthless, because he promises them a world where purebloods reign supreme and where might makes right. They follow him because he's never weak, never hesitant, never distracted by something as pathetic as human emotion. So, what happens when they notice their master acting strangely? What happens when he starts making decisions that don't align with pure tactical advantage? What happens when he shows mercy or concern, or, worst of all, fear for someone else's well-being? Some of the Death Eaters might see this as an opportunity. People like Lucius Malfoy, who are always calculating, always looking for advantages, might think about using this person to manipulate Voldemort. Others, like Bellatrix Lestrange, who loves Voldemort with a fanatic's devotion, would probably be insanely jealous. She spent years trying to earn his favor, his attention, his approval, and she'd see this other person as a rival, as someone who needs to be eliminated. The internal politics of the Death Eaters would become incredibly volatile. And then there's the question of how Voldemort would treat this person he loves. Would he even know how to show affection? He has no model for healthy relationships. His father abandoned his mother. He grew up in an orphanage where he terrorized other children. He's never had friends, never had family he cared about, never experienced any form of love. So if he suddenly feels it, how would he express it? Would he try to protect this person by keeping them close, essentially making them a prisoner? Would he shower them with dark magical artifacts as gifts, not understanding that normal people might not want cursed objects? Would he try to make them immortal too, seeing death as the ultimate threat to their relationship? There's a very real possibility that Voldemort's version of love would be twisted and possessive. He might not be capable of the selfless, healthy kind of love that makes someone want the best for their partner, even if it means letting them go. Instead, his love might manifest as obsession, as a need to control and own and keep forever. In trying to love someone, he might end up suffocating them, trapping them, making their life a gilded cage. And if they tried to leave, if they expressed unhappiness, how would he react? Could he let them go, or would he see their desire for freedom as betrayal? But let's explore a more optimistic scenario. Let's say that this love, however it began, starts to genuinely change Voldemort. Let's say that the person he falls for is someone who challenges him, someone who isn't afraid of him, someone who sees through the Dark Lord persona to the broken man underneath. Maybe there's someone who knew him as Tom Riddle before he became a monster. Maybe there's someone who has the courage to tell him the truth, to point out that immortality means nothing if you spend eternity alone and empty. In this scenario, Voldemort might start questioning everything. He might look at his Horcruxes and see them not as achievements but as chains, pieces of himself scattered and hidden, keeping him from ever being whole. He might look at his Death Eaters and realize they don't actually care about him, they care about power and what he can give them. He might look at his quest for immortality and recognize it for what it really is, not strength but the deepest fear of all, the fear of death, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that his life meant nothing. Love could force Voldemort to confront his own humanity. And that's a terrifying prospect for him because accepting his humanity means accepting his mortality, his limitations, his capacity for error. It means accepting that he's not a god, not invincible, not above the concerns of ordinary people. It means accepting that he was wrong about love being weakness. And for someone who's built their entire identity on being right, on being superior, on being beyond human concerns, that realization would shatter everything. Now let's think about how this affects the larger Harry Potter story. If Voldemort falls in love at any point during the series, the entire trajectory changes. Let's say it happens early, maybe during his first rise to power in the 70s. If Voldemort is distracted by love, does he still hunt down the Potters? Does he still hear the prophecy about a boy who could defeat him and decide that baby must die? Maybe love makes him less paranoid, less willing to murder a child based on a prophecy. Or maybe it makes him more paranoid, because now he has something to lose. And he'll do anything to protect it. If it happens during his time as a wraith, between his first defeat and his resurrection, that's interesting too. Imagine Voldemort, barely alive, sustained only by his Horcruxes, and somehow he encounters someone who stirs something in whatever remains of his soul. Maybe it's the person who helps him regain his body. Maybe it's someone who finds him in the Albanian forests where he's hiding. In this weakened state, might he be more vulnerable to emotional connection? Might the isolation and helplessness he experiences make him crave companionship for the first time? Or perhaps it happens after his resurrection in Goblet of Fire. He's back. He has a body again, he's gathering his Death Eaters. And then he meets someone, maybe at a society gathering he infiltrates. Maybe one of his Death Eaters has a family member he encounters, and something unexpected happens. In this timeline, Harry Potter is already his enemy. The plans are already in motion. But suddenly Voldemort has a reason to pause, to reconsider, to think about what he actually wants his future to look like. The confrontation between Harry and Voldemort would be fundamentally different if Voldemort is capable of love. The entire thematic core of the series is that Harry's capacity for love is what makes him strong, and Voldemort's inability to love is what makes him weak. But if Voldemort learns to love, if he develops that capacity, then he and Harry aren't opposites anymore. They're more similar than different. Two people who've suffered, who've lost, who've had to make choices about what kind of person they want to be. The final battle wouldn't be about love versus lovelessness. It would be about what you do with love, how you let it change you, whether you let it make you better, or whether you twist it into something dark. There's also the question of redemption. Can Voldemort be redeemed? In the original series, Rowling says no. Even at the moment of his death, Voldemort feels no remorse. Dumbledore tells Harry that Voldemort has gone too far, done too much, destroyed too much of his soul to ever come back. But what if love changes that equation? What if love is the catalyst for remorse? What if caring about someone makes Voldemort look back at all the people he's hurt, all the lives he's destroyed, all the families he's torn apart, and for the first time, he actually feels bad about it? Remorse in the Harry Potter universe is supposed to be able to repair a soul. It's mentioned that if Voldemort felt true remorse, his soul could be made whole again, though the process would probably kill him. So if love leads to remorse and remorse leads to a healed soul, we might end up in a situation where Voldemort has to choose between continuing as the Dark Lord with a fractured soul, or becoming fully human again and potentially dying in the process. That's a hell of a choice, and the person he loves would likely be at the center of that decision. Let's explore some specific scenarios about who Voldemort might fall in love with, because that matters enormously to how this story plays out. If he falls for another Death Eater, someone who shares his pure blood ideology and his ambitions, That's very different from falling for someone who opposes everything he stands for. If it's Bellatrix Lestrange, for example, their relationship would probably be mutually destructive, two damaged people enabling each other's worst impulses. They'd probably try to conquer the world together, seeing their love as proof that they're meant to rule. That doesn't redeem Voldemort. That just gives him a partner in crime. But what if he falls for someone completely unexpected? What if it's a Muggle, which would be deeply ironic given his hatred of non-magical people? Imagine Voldemort encountering a Muggle woman who has no idea who he is, who treats him like a normal person, who isn't afraid because she doesn't know she should be. Maybe in this interaction, stripped of his reputation and his power, he experiences genuine human connection for the first time. Would that force him to reconsider his beliefs about Muggle inferiority? Would he be able to reconcile his feelings for this individual with his ideology, or would cognitive dissonance tear him apart? What if it's someone from the Order of the Phoenix? Imagine the conflict there. He loves someone who's actively working to defeat him. Every move he makes, they counter. Every plan he hatches, they try to thwart. But he can't bring himself to kill them, and they're starting to realize that the Dark Lord is pulling his punches where they're concerned. That would be an incredibly tense and complicated dynamic. They might try to use his feelings to undermine him, to convince him to stop, to change. He might try to convince them to join him, to see things his way. It would be a battle of wills and ideologies wrapped up in genuine emotion. Or what if, and this is perhaps the most interesting option, he falls for someone who knew him as Tom Riddle? Maybe someone from Hogwarts, someone who saw him before he became a monster, someone who remembers the brilliant, charismatic boy who could have been anything but chose darkness. This person would have a unique perspective. They'd know that Voldemort wasn't always this way, that Tom Riddle made choices that led him down this path. They might believe he could make different choices. They might see the person he could have been, and mourn for the person he became. This type of relationship would force Voldemort to confront his past in a way he's probably spent decades avoiding. Tom Riddle is someone he left behind, a name he considers weak and unworthy. But if someone he loves knew Tom Riddle, liked Tom Riddle, maybe even preferred Tom Riddle to Lord Voldemort, what does he do with that? Does he try to become Tom again? Does he insist that Tom is dead and Voldemort is all that remains? The identity crisis alone would be fascinating to explore. Let's also consider the practical magical implications. Voldemort is a master of dark magic. He's invented spells, created Horcruxes, pushed the boundaries of what magic can do. But he's completely ignorant of certain types of magic, specifically the magic of love and protection that comes from it. If he's suddenly capable of love, does that open up new magical abilities? Could he cast a Patronus, something he's never been able to do because it requires happy memories and positive emotion? Could he understand and counteract the protection that love provides in ways he couldn't before? On the flip side, would loving someone make him more vulnerable to certain magics? Love-based protections work both ways. If Voldemort loves someone and they die protecting him, would their sacrifice create the same kind of shield that Lily Potter's sacrifice created for Harry? Could that fundamentally change how magic works around him? And what about the Horcruxes? If love starts healing his soul, do the Horcruxes become unstable? Do they start to reject the pieces of soul they contain because those pieces are trying to return to wholeness? There's also the question of whether the person Voldemort loves could be used against him by his enemies. Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix would absolutely try to leverage this weakness if they discovered it. They'd be torn, of course, because using an innocent person as bait or a hostage isn't something the good guys typically do. But when you're fighting someone as dangerous as Voldemort, when lives are on the line, how far are you willing to go? Would Dumbledore use Voldemort's love against him? Would Harry? These are difficult moral questions that would test the hero's principles. And what about the person Voldemort loves? How do they feel about all this? Are they horrified to be the object of a dark wizard's affection? Are they conflicted because they have feelings too? Are they trying to use the situation to stop him from hurting people? Do they see it as an opportunity for redemption, both his and theirs? This person would be in an impossibly difficult position. They couldn't exactly go to the authorities and say, "The Dark Lord is in love with me, what should I do?" They'd be isolated, probably afraid, definitely confused, and forced to make choices that could affect the entire wizarding world. Let's imagine some specific scenes this scenario might create. Picture Voldemort in his headquarters, maybe Malfoy Manor, surrounded by Death Eaters planning an attack. They're discussing who to kill, how to maximize terror, where to strike next. And Voldemort is barely listening because he's thinking about this person. He's wondering if they're safe, if they're thinking about him, if they're angry with him for something he did. Lucius Malfoy asks him a question about strategy, and Voldemort snaps at him because he's distracted. The Death Eaters exchange glances. Something is wrong with the Dark Lord, or imagine a scene where Voldemort tries to be romantic. He's never done this before. He doesn't know what normal people do when they're courting someone. Does he try to give gifts? If so, what kind? I've brought you this ancient cursed amulet that grants the wearer power over serpents. Is probably not going to go over well. Does he try to spend time with them? Take them somewhere? His idea of a nice evening might be showing off his dark magic or discussing theories of immortality, which again, probably not romantic to most people. There could be a scene where the person he loves sees him do something terrible, witnesses him hurt or kill someone, and they're forced to confront what he really is. He might try to explain, to justify, to make them understand that this is necessary, that this is who he is. And they might look at him with disappointment or disgust or sadness, and for the first time in his life, Voldemort would care what someone thinks of him. He'd want their approval. He'd want them to see him as something other than a monster, and that wanting would be completely foreign and deeply uncomfortable, or there could be a moment of genuine tenderness, brief and unexpected. Maybe she's injured, or he finds her crying about something, and his first instinct isn't to dismiss it or use it as weakness, but to comfort. He might not know how. He might just stand there awkwardly wanting to help, but not knowing what to do. And maybe she takes his hand, or leans against him, and for just a moment, he understands why people value this feeling, why they write poetry about it, why they're willing to die for it. The transformation wouldn't be instant or complete. Voldemort has spent decades being a certain way. He's committed atrocities. He's built an entire philosophy around might making right and love being for fools. One person, one feeling, isn't going to instantly undo all of that. There would be setbacks. There would be moments where he reverts to his old self, where fear or anger, or the instinct for self-preservation overrides everything else. He might hurt the person he loves, not physically perhaps, but emotionally, because he doesn't know how to do this, how to be vulnerable, how to let someone in. And the person he loves would have to decide if they're willing to stay, if they believe he can change, if the glimpses of humanity they see are worth the risk of staying close to one of the most dangerous wizards alive. They'd probably go back and forth, leaving and returning, hoping and despairing, seeing progress and then seeing him do something that reminds them exactly who they're dealing with. It would be messy and complicated and painful for everyone involved. The ending of this story could go several ways. Maybe love does redeem Voldemort. Maybe in the end, he chooses the person he loves over power, over immortality, over everything he's worked for. Maybe he destroys his Horcruxes, surrenders to the Ministry, accepts punishment for his crimes, because living with love and dying as a whole person is better than existing forever as a fractured shell. That would be a hopeful ending, though a costly one, or maybe he can't change enough. Maybe the damage is too deep, the crimes too many, the darkness too ingrained. Maybe he tries, genuinely tries to be better, but in a moment of crisis, he makes a choice that proves he's still the same person. Maybe he kills someone to protect his love, or sacrifices innocent people to keep them safe, and they realize that his version of love is still fundamentally selfish and destructive. They leave, and he's left alone with the knowledge that he was capable of feeling love but not capable of letting it change him. That's a tragic ending, but perhaps a more realistic one. Or maybe, and this is the darkest option, his love becomes corrupted. Maybe the person he falls for is seduced by his power, or breaks under the pressure, or is transformed by dark magic. Maybe they become like him, and instead of love redeeming Voldemort, Voldemort's darkness consumes them both. They become a dark power couple, ruling through fear and calling it love. In this version, the feeling was real, but it wasn't enough to overcome who he fundamentally is. There's also the possibility of a bittersweet ending. Maybe the person Voldemort loves is killed, despite his efforts to protect them. Maybe they die in the war, or as a consequence of his actions, or simply because being close to him makes them a target. And Voldemort is left with grief, an emotion he's also never really experienced. Does grief drive him further into darkness, making him more vengeful and cruel? Or does it break something in him, make him realize that all his power couldn't save the one person who mattered? Does he finally feel remorse, not for his victims, but for what his choices cost him personally? The Harry Potter series would have to end differently in any of these scenarios. The final confrontation at Hogwarts, if it happens at all, would be about different things. It wouldn't be good versus evil in a clear-cut way. It would be about choices, about what kind of person you choose to be when you have the capacity for both great good and great evil. Harry has always had that capacity. The Sorting Hat wanted to put him in Slytherin. He could have turned dark, but he chose not to. If Voldemort also has that capacity, if he's also making choices, then they're not destined enemies. They're two people on different paths who might have taken each other's road under different circumstances. Dumbledore's role in this version of events would be interesting too. He's always believed in giving people second chances, in the power of love, in redemption, but he's also pragmatic. He knows Voldemort is dangerous. He knows how many people have died. Would he support Voldemort's attempt to change? Or would he see it as too little, too late? Would he try to help? Or would he work to ensure Voldemort faces justice regardless of his newfound capacity for feeling? Dumbledore's choice would say something important about the limits of forgiveness and redemption. The wizarding world at large would be divided. Some people would never forgive Voldemort, regardless of whether he changed. They'd lost family members, friends, their whole world had been terrorized. Saying sorry or falling in love doesn't bring back the dead. Others might see a changed Voldemort as proof that anyone can be redeemed, that it's never too late. There would be intense debate about whether he should be executed, imprisoned, or given a chance to make amends. These aren't easy questions, and different characters would have different answers. From a storytelling perspective, this scenario is rich with possibilities because it takes the central theme of Harry Potter, that love is the most powerful magic, and pushes it to its logical extreme. If love is truly that powerful, then it should be able to touch even the darkest heart. But the series also makes clear that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice, it's action, it's sacrifice. So Voldemort feeling love is just the beginning. What matters is what he does with that feeling, how he lets it shape his choices, whether he's willing to sacrifice for it the way others have. This hypothetical also highlights the tragedy of Voldemort's character in a new way. In the original series, he's tragic because he doesn't know what he's missing. He thinks love is weakness, and he's confident in that belief. But if he falls in love, if he experiences it and understands what it is, then he knows exactly what he destroyed when he tore his soul apart. He knows what he gave up in his quest for power. That knowledge would be agonizing. Every moment of happiness with the person he loves would be tainted by the understanding of what he could have had if he'd made different choices decades ago. The person he loves would also become tragic in a different way. They'd have access to a side of Voldemort that no one else sees. They'd know he's capable of gentleness, of caring, of being something other than a monster. But they'd also know about all the terrible things he's done, and they'd have to live with the guilt of caring about someone responsible for so much suffering. How do you reconcile loving someone with hating their actions? How do you hold space for both the humanity you see in private moments and the monstrosity you know exists? That internal conflict would be devastating. Let's think about how different characters would react to the news that Voldemort is in love. Harry would probably be deeply skeptical. He's faced Voldemort multiple times. He's been inside his mind. He knows what Voldemort is capable of. Harry might think it's a trick, a manipulation, a scheme to lower people's guards. Even if convinced it's real, Harry might not believe it matters. Voldemort has done too much damage. Feeling love doesn't erase that. Hermione would probably be fascinated from an academic perspective. She'd want to understand how it's possible, what it means for magical theory, whether there are historical precedents. But she'd also be cautious. Hermione is practical and protective of the people she loves. She wouldn't want Harry or anyone else endangered because they believed Voldemort had changed when he might just be more dangerous in a new way. Ron would probably make jokes to cover his discomfort. The idea of Voldemort in love would seem absurd to him, but underneath the humor, he'd be worried. Ron understands family and love deeply. He'd know that if Voldemort truly cares about someone, that person is in terrible danger, either from Voldemort's enemies or from Voldemort himself. Snape's reaction would be particularly interesting. Snape loved Lily Potter his entire life. That love never made him a good person, not entirely. He was still cruel to students, still bullied Harry. But it also motivated him to protect Harry, to work as a double agent, to ultimately sacrifice his life. Snape would understand, perhaps better than anyone, that love doesn't automatically make you good, and that loving someone doesn't erase your past or make your victims forgive you. He'd probably see a kindred spirit in a Voldemort capable of love, someone else destroyed and defined by an emotion he can barely express. The Death Eater's reactions would vary. The true believers, the ones who follow Voldemort's ideology genuinely, would be horrified. They'd see it as weakness, as betrayal of everything they stand for. Some might try to stage a coup, arguing that Voldemort is no longer fit to lead. Others would stay loyal but confused, trying to reconcile the Dark Lord they worship with this new version who apparently has feelings. The opportunists, the ones who follow Voldemort for power rather than belief, might see it as a chance to gain influence or might decide it's time to switch sides since their leader is compromised. The broader magical community would be torn between hope and fear. Hope that maybe the war could end without more bloodshed, that Voldemort might be reasoned with or changed. Fear that this is a new tactic, that Voldemort in love might be even more dangerous because now he has something to fight for beyond just power. Newspapers like the Daily Prophet would have a field day. Rita Skeeter would write scandalous articles full of speculation and rumor. Some would claim the whole thing is fabricated. Others would interview supposed experts on love magic and what it means. Ministry officials would face an impossible situation. How do you prosecute someone who's committed countless crimes but might be changing? Do you wait and see if the change is real, risking more deaths if it's not? Do you strike while he might be vulnerable, potentially missing an opportunity for peace? Do you try to negotiate? And if so, what are the terms? These decisions would tear apart the ministry, with different factions advocating different approaches. From a philosophical standpoint, this scenario asks important questions about the nature of evil and redemption. Is someone defined by their worst actions forever, or can they change? If Voldemort is literally incapable of love due to how he was conceived and then gains that capability somehow, is he responsible for the things he did when he lacked that fundamental aspect of humanity? That's a deep question, without an easy answer. On one hand, he still made choices, still chose cruelty and power. On the other hand, if he was operating with a fundamental deficit, a missing piece of what makes us human, can we judge him by the same standards? The story would also explore what love means in different contexts. The Harry Potter series shows us many types of love: parental love, romantic love, friendship, loyalty, sacrifice. Voldemort's love would probably be different from all of these because he's learning it for the first time as an adult, without any model or framework. It might be possessive and jealous. It might be confused and uncertain. It might be desperate, the love of someone who's been alone their entire life and suddenly isn't. Understanding that Voldemort's experience of love is different from a healthy person's love would be crucial to the story. There's also the question of whether the person he loves can truly consent to a relationship with him. Voldemort is arguably the most powerful wizard alive. He's feared throughout the magical world. He can read minds, control people, kill with a word. Even if he doesn't use these powers on the person he loves, the threat of them is always there. Can you have a real, equal relationship with someone when the power imbalance is that extreme? Can you ever be sure they're with you because they want to be and not because they're afraid of what happens if they leave? This imbalance would poison the relationship, making genuine intimacy nearly impossible. The story might include moments where Voldemort tries to learn what love means. Maybe he reads books about it, trying to understand intellectually what he's feeling emotionally. Maybe he watches couples, observing how they interact, trying to copy behaviors without understanding the sentiment behind them. There's something both sad and slightly funny about the image of the Dark Lord researching how to be romantic, trying to figure out what makes people happy, consulting his Death Eaters awkwardly about relationship advice. None of them would know what to say. The Dark Lord is asking me about flowers. What do I do? Magic might manifest differently around Voldemort if he's capable of love. The atmosphere around him has always been described as cold and dark. Dementors are drawn to him. Plants wither in his presence. Animals flee. But what if that starts to change? What if, as he becomes capable of positive emotion, the world around him responds differently? It would be subtle at first. Maybe a flower doesn't immediately die when he walks past. Maybe a bird doesn't fly away in terror. These small changes would be noticeable to anyone paying attention, and they'd be signs that something fundamental has shifted in Voldemort's magical essence. The Horcruxes would become increasingly problematic. In the books, Horcruxes contain fragments of soul that are frozen at the moment of their creation. They don't grow or change. But if Voldemort's main soul piece, the one in his body, starts to heal and change through love, what happens to those frozen fragments? Do they become incompatible with the main soul? Do they start to cause him pain, like foreign objects that his body is rejecting? He might find himself weakening, not because he's being attacked, but because the very things meant to keep him alive are now working against his transformation. This could lead to a crucial decision point. To fully embrace love, to fully become capable of it, Voldemort might need to destroy his own Horcruxes. But destroying them means becoming mortal again. It means accepting that he will die someday. For someone who's spent his entire adult life trying to conquer death, this would be the ultimate test. Is love worth mortality? Is being whole worth being vulnerable? The person he loves might be the one who convinces him, arguing that a mortal lifetime filled with genuine connection is worth more than an immortal existence of emptiness. Imagine the scene where Voldemort destroys his first Horcrux voluntarily. He'd probably choose to start with one of the less significant ones, maybe the cup or the locket. He'd hold it, this object that contains a piece of his soul, this thing he created through murder and dark magic. And he'd have to willingly destroy it, knowing that he's making himself weaker, more vulnerable, more human. The magical feedback would be intense. Part of his soul returning, memories flooding back, emotions he hasn't felt in decades suddenly accessible again. It would be agonizing and liberating at the same time. Each Horcrux he destroys would make him more human and less like the Dark Lord. His appearance might even start to change. The snake-like features, the red eyes, the flat nose, these are all consequences of his dark magic and his fractured soul. As his soul heals, would his appearance become more human? Would he start to look more like Tom Riddle again? The physical transformation would be a visible representation of his internal change, and it would shock everyone who sees it. But let's not forget that redemption isn't easy or simple. Voldemort has killed hundreds of people, maybe thousands. He's ordered deaths, performed them personally, tortured victims for information or pleasure. He's destroyed families, orphaned children, widowed spouses. No amount of love or change brings those people back. Their loved ones don't get closure just because Voldemort fell in love. The weight of those crimes is staggering, and truly confronting them would break most people. If Voldemort genuinely changes, if he develops a conscience and the capacity for remorse, he'd have to live with the full knowledge of what he's done. Every face, every name, every scream. The memories that he could distance himself from when he was incapable of empathy would suddenly become vivid and painful. He'd understand, really understand, the suffering he caused. That understanding might be more punishment than any prison could provide. He'd be tormented by his own memories, unable to escape or forget, forced to confront the monster he was every single day. The person he loves would have to help him through this, assuming they stay. They'd watch him break down, watch him struggle with guilt and self-hatred, watch him grapple with whether he deserves to live or be happy. They'd have to decide if they can support someone through that kind of moral reckoning. It's one thing to love someone who's flawed. It's another thing entirely to love someone whose flaws include mass murder. The emotional toll on both of them would be immense. There's also the practical question of what Voldemort does if he changes. Does he try to make amends? How do you make amends for killing someone's parent or child? Money doesn't bring them back. Apologies ring hollow. Some wrongs can't be righted, some damage can't be undone. He might dedicate himself to fighting dark wizards, using his knowledge and power for good. He might work to dismantle the pure-blood supremacy ideology he helped spread. He might turn himself in and accept whatever punishment the wizarding world decides. But none of it would feel like enough because it isn't enough. Nothing could be. The legal and political ramifications would be enormous. If Voldemort surrenders or is captured, what happens next? The wizarding world doesn't have great precedent for this. Death Eaters were given trials after his first fall, and many of them claimed to be under the Imperious Curse or coerced. Some were sent to Azkaban, others got off with fines or house arrest. But Voldemort is different. He's the leader, the architect, the one who can't claim he was forced or manipulated. By any measure, he deserves the Dementor's kiss or execution, but if he's genuinely changed, if he's no longer a threat, is executing him justice or revenge? This question would divide the wizarding world. Victims' families would want him dead, understandably. They'd argue that change doesn't erase crimes, that he needs to pay for what he did. Others might argue that a changed Voldemort is more valuable alive, that he has knowledge and power that could be used for good, that killing him wastes an opportunity. Still others might argue on principle that execution is wrong regardless of the crime, that even Voldemort deserves a chance at redemption. The trial would be the most significant event in wizarding history. Every seat in the courtroom would be filled. Witnesses would line up to testify about his crimes. Evidence would be presented, memories shown in pensives, victims' families would give impact statements. And Voldemort would have to sit there and listen to it all, hear the full accounting of his actions, see the faces of people he destroyed. If he's truly changed, he wouldn't defend himself. He'd plead guilty to everything. He'd accept responsibility. And that itself would be shocking, because the old Voldemort would never admit fault or show weakness. His testimony would be crucial. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry" seems inadequate to the point of insult. But what else is there? He might explain what he was, how he couldn't feel or understand love, how his entire worldview was warped by his inability to connect with others. He might explain how falling in love changed him, gave him perspective, made him realize the enormity of what he'd done. Some people would believe him. Most wouldn't. They'd think it's manipulation, another scheme, a way to avoid punishment. The person he loves might testify on his behalf, explaining what they've witnessed, how he's changed, arguing for mercy, or at least for life imprisonment instead of execution. But their testimony would be viewed with suspicion. They're compromised, emotionally involved, possibly under magical influence even if they're not. How can anyone trust the word of Voldemort's lover? They might even face legal consequences themselves for harboring a fugitive or aiding a criminal, depending on when the relationship started and what they knew. Let's consider how the different magical creatures and beings would view this situation. House elves, who Voldemort views as slaves, would probably be skeptical of his change. Centaurs, who can read signs and prophecies, might have insights into whether his transformation is genuine or fated to fail. Goblins, who have long memories and their own grievances with wizards, might see Voldemort's fall from power as justice regardless of his feelings. Werewolves, many of whom Voldemort recruited with promises of freedom and power, would feel betrayed if he renounces his ideology. The magical world is diverse, and each group would have their own perspective. Dragons, phoenixes, and other magical creatures might respond to Voldemort differently if his soul is healing. Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix, never tolerated Voldemort's presence. Phoenixes are symbols of rebirth and renewal, and they're drawn to goodness. If Voldemort truly changes, would a phoenix approach him? That would be powerful symbolism, a creature of light accepting someone who was once the embodiment of darkness. Similarly, dragons are said to be able to sense ill intent. If Voldemort no longer radiates malice and hatred, dragons might not automatically attack him. The story could include a moment where Voldemort attempts to cast a Patronus, something he's never been able to do. The Patronus charm requires happy memories and positive feelings, things Voldemort has traditionally lacked. His first attempts would probably fail. He'd think of the person he loves, think of moments with them, and maybe a wisp of silver vapor would emerge from his wand, shapeless and weak. But it would be progress, proof that he's capable of the magic of joy and protection, not just destruction and fear. Eventually, if his transformation is complete, he might successfully cast a full Patronus. The form it takes would be significant. In the books, Patronuses often reflect something about the caster's personality or connections. James Potter's was a stag, Lily's a doe, Snape's also a doe because of his love for Lily. What would Voldemort's Patronus be? Perhaps something that represents Tom Riddle before he became corrupted, a reminder of the boy he was. Or maybe something that symbolizes his love, a creature that represents the person who changed him. The moment a full corporeal Patronus erupts from Voldemort's wand would be stunning, a visual representation that the impossible has happened. The magical community would have to grapple with what Voldemort's change means for their understanding of good and evil. The Harry Potter universe tends toward moral clarity. There are good people and bad people, light and dark. But a Voldemort who changes challenges that binary. It suggests that people are more complicated, that someone can be genuinely evil and then genuinely change. That's uncomfortable because it means evil isn't a fixed state, and if Voldemort can change, what does that say about how we treat other criminals? Should everyone get a chance at redemption? Where's the line? Different schools of magic around the world might weigh in. Beauxbaton, Durmstrang, Ilvermorny, Mahutokoro, each institution has its own philosophy and approach to magic. Some might argue that dark magic fundamentally corrupts, and Voldemort's change is impossible or temporary. Others might point to their own traditions of redemption and second chances. The international magical community would be watching closely, because Voldemort's actions affected wizards worldwide. His ideology inspired dark wizards in other countries. His fall or redemption would have global implications. There's also the question of what happens to the Death Eaters if Voldemort genuinely renounces his ideology. Some, like Lucius Malfoy, might quickly claim they were always uncomfortable with the extremism and are relieved their leader has seen reason. Others, like Bellatrix, would view it as the ultimate betrayal and might try to kill Voldemort themselves, seeing him as a traitor to their cause. The most fanatical followers might splinter off, arguing that the real Voldemort would never give up, that this must be an impostor or someone under a curse. They'd continue the fight in his name, which would be deeply ironic and painful for a changed Voldemort to witness. The younger Death Eaters, people who were recruited or born into families that supported Voldemort, might feel differently. Draco Malfoy, for instance, never really wanted to be a Death Eater. He was scared, pressured by his family, in over his head. If Voldemort publicly renounces everything and tries to make amends, that might give people like Draco permission to do the same. It might break the cycle of darkness in pure-blood families. Parents who raise their children with Voldemort's ideology might have to reconsider what they've taught, especially if the Dark Lord himself is saying it was wrong. Imagine a scene where Voldemort meets with former Death Eaters and tells them he was wrong, that pure-blood supremacy is a lie, that Muggles and Muggleborns aren't inferior, that everything he taught them was based on his own brokenness and fear. Some would be angry, feeling their lives were wasted serving a lie. Some would be relieved, finally free of an ideology they never fully believed. Some would be in denial, unable to accept that their entire worldview is collapsing. The meeting would be tense, possibly violent, definitely emotional. The relationship between Voldemort and Harry would have to fundamentally change. In the original series, they're linked by prophecy, by magic, by Voldemort's attempt to kill Harry as a baby. They share a mental connection through the Horcrux that was accidentally placed in Harry. They're destined enemies. But if Voldemort is no longer pursuing power and immortality, if he's no longer a threat, what becomes of their connection? Do they eventually have a conversation, really talk, about everything that's happened? Could they ever find any kind of peace or understanding? Harry has every reason to hate Voldemort. This man killed his parents, tried to kill him multiple times, murdered his friends and mentors. But Harry also knows what it's like to be an orphan, to feel alone, to struggle with darkness inside himself. If Voldemort genuinely changes, Harry might be one of the few people who could understand how someone becomes what Voldemort was and how they might come back from it. That doesn't mean Harry forgives him. It doesn't mean they become friends. But there might be a grudging respect, an acknowledgement that life is complicated and people contain multitudes. There could be a powerful scene where Voldemort apologizes to Harry specifically, not just for trying to kill him, but for killing his parents, for taking away his childhood, for the years of fear and pain. Harry would be well within his rights to reject the apology, to say it's not enough, that nothing Voldemort says or does will ever make up for what he took. And Voldemort would have to accept that, understand that some people will never forgive him, and that's their right. Learning to live with the consequences of his actions, including the hatred and inability to forgive, would be part of his redemption. The Wizarding World's media would be obsessed with this story. Every development would be front-page news. Journalists would try to interview the person Voldemort loves, offering huge sums of money for exclusive stories. There would be tell-all books, probably some of them fabricated, claiming to have inside information. Some publications would be sympathetic, framing it as a love story and a redemption arc. Others would be hostile, calling it a manipulation and demanding justice. The public opinion would swing back and forth based on whatever the latest revelation or rumor was. Eventually, A decision would have to be made about Voldemort's fate. Execution, life imprisonment, conditional freedom with restrictions, or full pardon are the main options. Each comes with consequences. Execution would give closure to victims, but prevent any possibility of Voldemort making amends or using his knowledge for good. Life imprisonment keeps him contained but at great expense, and with the constant risk of escape or rescue. Conditional freedom means he's monitored, may be bound by magical restrictions, allowed to live, but not free. Full pardon seems unlikely given the severity of his crimes, but some might argue for it if he's providing valuable service or information. Whatever is decided, roughly half the wizarding world would be furious. This isn't a case where there's a clearly right answer. Every option involves trade-offs between justice, safety, practical considerations, and philosophical principles. The Minister of Magic who has to make or approve this decision would likely lose their job over it, regardless of what they choose. It's a no-win situation politically, which is why they might try to pass it to the Wizengamot, spreading the responsibility and blame among many rather than bearing it alone. Let's imagine that Voldemort is allowed to live, perhaps under strict conditions. What does his life look like? He can't go back to being Tom Riddle, young and handsome and promising. Even if his appearance becomes more human, he's still aged, still marked by dark magic, still infamous. He can't walk down Diagon Alley without being recognized and either attacked or hounded. He'd probably have to live in isolation, perhaps in a secure location protected by the Ministry, with the person he loves if they choose to stay with him. His days would be strange and quiet after a lifetime of pursuing power and commanding followers. Maybe he reads, catching up on all the magic and history he ignored while focused on immortality. Maybe he writes, documenting his knowledge of dark magic so it can be studied and defended against. Maybe he works on developing magic that heals or protects, trying to create something positive to balance the scales even slightly. Maybe he just exists, living each quiet day, which for someone who thought he'd live forever through grand acts is its own kind of adjustment. The person he loves would have to decide if they can build a life in these circumstances. It's not the life anyone would choose. They'd be isolated, probably monitored, definitely judged. They couldn't have normal friendships or a normal job. Any children would be complicated, bearing the legacy of being Voldemort's child. Every aspect of life would be affected by who their partner is and what he's done. Many people would walk away, deciding that love isn't worth this price. But if they stay, it's a powerful statement about commitment and belief in redemption. As years pass, the wizarding world would gradually move on. New threats would emerge, new stories would dominate the news. Voldemort would become less a present danger and more a historical figure, someone younger wizards learn about in school but don't remember personally. The passionate hatred might fade to a general distaste. The victims and their families wouldn't forget, but others would. In a generation or two, Voldemort might be thought of the way we think of historical villains, terrible but distant, someone whose crimes are known but not felt. This raises questions about legacy and how we remember people. Voldemort wanted to be immortal, to be remembered forever, and he will be remembered, but as a cautionary tale, a villain, possibly as someone who changed, but only after tremendous damage. That's not the legacy he wanted. If he's genuinely changed, he has to accept that history will never remember him primarily as someone who loved or tried to redeem himself. He'll always be the Dark Lord first, and everything else is a footnote. Living with that knowledge, knowing you can never escape your past even if you've changed, is its own kind of punishment. The person who loved Voldemort would also have a complicated legacy. They might be seen as either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, either a hero who saved the wizarding world by changing Voldemort, or a collaborator who should have rejected him. History's judgment would depend partly on how successful Voldemort's change is and how much harm is prevented because of it. If he helps prevent future dark wizards or shares knowledge that saves lives, they're part of that positive legacy. If he eventually reverts or causes more harm, they're blamed for enabling him. From a purely magical perspective, a reformed Voldemort would be an incredible resource. He knows more about dark magic than anyone alive. He's invented spells, created magical objects, pushed the boundaries of what's possible. If he's willing to share that knowledge, to teach Aurors how to defend against dark magic, to help develop counter-curses and protections, he could save countless lives. The Ministry would be torn between wanting to use his expertise and not wanting to give him any platform or influence. It's a Faustian bargain. accepting help from someone who's caused so much harm. There's something deeply tragic about Voldemort gaining the capacity for love only after he's destroyed any chance at a normal life. If he'd been capable of love as a young man, if he'd felt connected to others, he might have become a great wizard who was remembered fondly, who made positive contributions, who lived a full and happy life. Instead, he gets to experience love in a context of tremendous loss, guilt, and limitation. He knows what he missed, knows what he could have had, and that knowledge is torture. It's worse in some ways than never having known love at all. The ultimate question this scenario poses is whether redemption is always possible, or whether some people go too far to ever come back. Different people have different answers based on their beliefs about human nature, justice, and mercy. The Harry Potter series suggests that redemption is possible but costly. Snape redeems himself, but dies doing it, and that it requires genuine remorse and sacrifice. For Voldemort, redemption might require giving up everything, his power, his freedom, his identity, perhaps even his life eventually. And even then, he might never be truly forgiven by those he's hurt. There's also the philosophical question of identity. If Voldemort changes so fundamentally that he's no longer pursuing dark magic, no longer cruel, no longer seeking power, is he still Voldemort? Or has he become Tom Riddle again? Or is he someone entirely new, neither the boy he was nor the monster he became, but a third thing, forged through love and suffering and change? Identity is complicated, and whether someone can fundamentally change, or whether they're always on some level, who they've always been, is a deep question without an easy answer. The implications for magical education would be profound. Hogwarts would need to decide whether to teach about this period in history, and if so, how. Do you present Voldemort as purely evil, or do you acknowledge the complexity of someone who changed? Different professors would have different views. Professor McGonagall, who lived through both wars, might insist on teaching the full truth, including the horror of his crimes and the possibility of his change. Others might argue that young students need clear moral examples, not complicated stories about villains who fall in love. The textbooks would be rewritten. Previously, Voldemort was presented as the ultimate dark wizard, someone who chose evil and never wavered. Now the narrative becomes more complex. Historians would debate endlessly about what his change means, whether it was genuine, what factors contributed to it, whether love really has that kind of power. Some scholars would write papers arguing that Voldemort never truly changed, that it was all manipulation. Others would write equally passionate defenses of the transformative power of love. Academic conferences would be dedicated to this question for decades. Students at Hogwarts would have intense discussions about it. In defense against the dark arts classes, when learning about Horcruxes and dark magic, Voldemort would be the primary example. But now there's this additional layer. Can someone who's created Horcruxes be redeemed? If Voldemort could change, what does that mean about the nature of evil? These aren't abstract questions when the person being discussed might still be alive, might be living somewhere under ministry supervision. Some students would have parents who were victims of Voldemort's reign of terror. Their perspective would be very different from students who only know the story secondhand. The Slytherin house would face particular scrutiny. Voldemort was a Slytherin, and many Death Eaters came from that house. There's already prejudice against Slytherins in the wizarding world, a sense that they're more likely to turn dark. If Voldemort fell in love and changed, does that challenge those stereotypes or reinforce them? On one hand, it shows that even someone from Slytherin who went as dark as possible can come back. On the other hand, it might be used as evidence that Slytherins are inherently unstable or untrustworthy. The current Slytherin students would have to navigate these perceptions. Imagine a Slytherin student giving a presentation about Voldemort and history of magic. They'd have to balance acknowledging his crimes with exploring his possible redemption, all while their classmates from other houses watch skeptically. Some of them descendants of people Voldemort killed. The teacher would need to moderate carefully to prevent the discussion from becoming hostile. These classroom moments would be microcosms of the larger societal debate about Voldemort's legacy and what his story means. The Forbidden Forest would have its own perspective on Voldemort's transformation. The Centaurs, who read prophecies in the stars and have their own understanding of fate and destiny, might have seen signs of this coming. They might speak in their cryptic way about how even the darkest path can curve back toward light. Though the journey is long and painful, The centaurs don't involve themselves in wizard affairs typically, but something this significant might warrant commentary. They understand cycles, death, and rebirth, the way all things change over time. The giant spiders. Aragog's descendants would remember that Voldemort tried to recruit them, promised them freedom to hunt humans if they joined his cause. If he now renounces that ideology, are they disappointed? Do they care? Probably not much. Giant spiders have their own concerns. But it's a reminder that Voldemort's actions rippled out to affect every part of the magical world, even creatures who don't care about wizard politics. His change would ripple out too, though perhaps less dramatically. Thestrals, the skeletal horses visible only to those who've witnessed death, would be an interesting barometer. They're drawn to people who've experienced loss, who carry the weight of death with them. Voldemort has witnessed countless deaths, caused most of them. But Thestrals are also gentle creatures despite their appearance. They represent the acceptance of death rather than fear of it. If Voldemort learned to accept mortality, if he made peace with death rather than fighting desperately against it, would Thestrals respond to him differently? It's a small thing, but symbolically powerful. The Merpeople in the Black Lake would have their own songs about this era. Merpeople culture is old and they have long memories. They'd incorporate the story of the Dark Wizard who learned to love into their historical ballads, probably with their own interpretation that differs from the human understanding. They might see it as a cautionary tale about the surface world's obsession with power, or as proof that even the worst can change if the tides shift. Their songs would be passed down for generations, a different version of the story preserved in an alien culture. House elves present another interesting perspective. Voldemort viewed them as slaves, tools to be used. Dobby died fighting against everything Voldemort represented. Kreacher eventually came around to supporting Harry, despite his pure-blood family's ideology. If Voldemort changed his views on house elves, if he recognized them as people deserving of respect and rights, some house elves might be willing to forgive him. Others, particularly those who suffered under Death Eater families, would never forget or forgive. House elves are incredibly loyal but also capable of deep grudges. Their community would be divided. The goblins at Gringotts would watch all of this with interest, but also detachment. Goblins have their own complicated history with wizards, their own grievances about how they're treated, their own ideas about ownership and power. Voldemort broke into Gringotts, killed goblins who got in his way, stole from their vaults. His crimes against goblins are just one more item on a long list. If he tries to make amends, what could he possibly offer? Goblins don't forget debts, either the financial kind or the blood kind. They'd probably demand compensation, restitution, something tangible. Empty apologies wouldn't be enough. The relationship between Voldemort and Dumbledore's portrait would be fascinating if Dumbledore's portrait is still in the headmaster's office. Portraits in the Harry Potter world are magical imprints of the person, with their memories and personality. Dumbledore always believed in second chances, always saw the good in people. But he also recognized that Voldemort was beyond saving, or at least he thought so. If Voldemort returns to Hogwarts, perhaps to speak with McGonagall or to face some tribunal, and he encounters Dumbledore's portrait, what would they say to each other? Dumbledore's portrait might express surprise, curiosity, even a kind of melancholy satisfaction that he was wrong about Voldemort being irredeemable. He might ask Voldemort questions, trying to understand how this change happened, what it feels like, whether he's truly different or just playing another long game. Voldemort would have to face the man he killed, well, arranged to be killed, the man who saw through him from the beginning and knew what he was becoming even as a student. That conversation would be heavy with history and meaning. Dumbledore might say something like, "I must admit, Tom, I did not think I would ever see this day. I believed you had gone too far, that the choices you made had closed off all other paths. It brings me no joy to have been wrong, but if I was wrong, if redemption was always possible for you, then perhaps I failed you as a teacher. Perhaps I should have tried harder to guide you away from darkness when you were still young." And Voldemort would have to grapple with that, with the idea that maybe things could have been different if someone had reached him earlier. If someone had shown him love when he was still capable of receiving it. The Sorting Hat would have opinions too. The Hat has been sorting students for over 1,000 years, seeing into their minds and hearts, placing them where they belong. It sorted Tom Riddle into Slytherin all those years ago. Did it see what he would become? Did it have doubts? The Hat is meant to be impartial, but it's also designed to recognize potential for greatness, ambition, cunning. If Voldemort returned to Hogwarts and the hat could speak with him, it might reflect on its choice. Wonder if a different house might have led to a different outcome, or affirm that Slytherin was always right for him, but that being Slytherin doesn't determine your morality. The room of requirement would respond to Voldemort differently if his intentions changed. The room appears based on what the person needs, and it reflects their desires and state of mind. When Voldemort hid the diadem Horcrux there, the room provided a vast space filled with centuries of hidden objects, a perfect place to conceal something. If a changed Voldemort entered the room seeking redemption or understanding or peace, what would it show him? Maybe a simple room with the person he loves, a quiet space away from judgment and history. Maybe a library containing all the knowledge of light magic he never bothered to learn. Maybe a mirror showing him who he could have been. The wizarding prison Azkaban would be another major consideration. Azkaban is guarded by Dementors in the original timeline, though this changes after the war. Dementors feed on happiness and positive emotion, leaving people with only their worst memories and feelings. If Voldemort is imprisoned in Azkaban, the Dementors would be drawn to him intensely. But here's the interesting part. If Voldemort has genuinely learned to love, if he has happy memories now, the Dementors would feed on those. They'd take away his capacity to feel that love, leaving him only with the guilt and horror of his crimes. That might be considered a just punishment, destroying the very thing that changed him. But it would also be cruel and arguably counterproductive if the goal is rehabilitation. This raises the question of whether the wizarding world's justice system is equipped to deal with someone like Voldemort who's changed. The system is designed to punish and contain, not to rehabilitate or help people grow. Azkaban doesn't make people better, it breaks them down. If society genuinely believes people can change, then the justice system needs to reflect that. But creating a system that could handle someone as dangerous as Voldemort while also supporting his rehabilitation would be incredibly complex. The risk of escape or relapse would be constant. The guards would need to be carefully chosen, people who could be firm, but not cruel, who could recognize genuine progress, but not be manipulated. Alternative punishments might be considered. Perhaps Voldemort could be subjected to a Fidelius charm, his existence hidden, able to live but forgotten by the world. Perhaps he could be magically bound, his powers restricted so he can't harm anyone, but can still live and potentially do good. Perhaps he could be sent to a secure location, something like a magical monastery, where he lives under supervision but with some degree of autonomy. Each option has risks and benefits, and none of them feel entirely satisfactory. How do you punish someone who's committed atrocities but might genuinely be different now? The International Confederation of Wizards would need to be involved. Voldemort's crimes weren't limited to Britain. He had followers in other countries. His ideology spread internationally. He killed wizards from around the world. Representatives from other magical governments would want input on his fate. Some countries might demand extradition, wanting to try him for crimes committed in their territory. Others might recognize British authority but demand certain conditions be met. The diplomatic negotiations would be complex and tense, with each country balancing their own citizens' desire for justice against practical and political considerations. Imagine delegations from France, Germany, Russia, America, Japan, all gathering to discuss what to do about Voldemort. Each culture has different approaches to justice, different magical traditions, different histories with dark wizards. The French might advocate for a more philosophical approach, exploring what his change means for understanding human nature. The Americans might push for strict punishment and security measures, prioritizing public safety. The Japanese representatives might speak about honor and whether someone who's lost it can ever regain it. These cultural differences would add another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. The goblins would want representation at these meetings too, and they'd bring their own perspective on justice and debt. Goblin law is different from wizard law, with different priorities and different punishments. They might argue that Voldemort owes a blood debt to their community and that only goblin justice can settle it. The wizards would probably resist this, not wanting to set a precedent of goblins having jurisdiction over wizards, but the goblins have leverage. They control the banking system, and they have long memories. If they felt their justice was being ignored, they might make things difficult economically. Dragons would be affected by all of this in unexpected ways. Voldemort and his Death Eaters used dragons, stole dragon eggs, killed dragons for potion ingredients and wand cores. The Dragon Keeper community, people like Charlie Weasley, would have strong opinions about Voldemort. They work with dragons and understand them as intelligent, feeling creatures, not just beasts to be exploited. If Voldemort wants to make amends, he'd need to address his crimes against magical creatures too, not just against humans. Establishing dragon sanctuaries or funding dragon conservation might be one way, though it seems inadequate given the scale of harm done. The werewolf community would be particularly conflicted. Voldemort recruited werewolves by promising them a world where they wouldn't be discriminated against, where they could live openly and hunt freely. Fenrir Greyback and his pack committed terrible atrocities in Voldemort's name. If Voldemort renounces his ideology, what happens to those promises? Werewolves are already marginalized in wizarding society, facing discrimination and fear. Some of them joined Voldemort because they felt they had no other option, no other champion. His betrayal of that cause would leave them even more isolated and angry, but there might be werewolves who see Voldemort's change as an opportunity. If he's genuinely trying to make amends and build a better world, could he use his influence, what remains of it, to fight for werewolf rights? Could he advocate for the changes he once promised, but through legitimate means this time? Remus Lupin, if he were still alive, would have an interesting perspective on this. Lupin always tried to find the good in people, always believed in second chances, but he also experienced firsthand what it's like to be used and discarded by dark wizards. His voice would carry weight in the werewolf community. The vampire covens would also be watching these developments. Vampires are another marginalized group that Voldemort tried to recruit. Unlike werewolves, vampires tend to be more organized and political. They have leaders, councils, ancient hierarchies. They'd be calculating what Voldemort's change means for their position in wizarding society. If he's advocating for better treatment of dark creatures, does that help vampires too? Or does his history make him a liability, someone whose support actually hurts their cause? Vampire politics are complex and long-term. They think in decades and centuries, so their response would be measured and strategic. Giants are another group Voldemort recruited, promising them land and freedom to live as they wish. Hagrid's brother Grawp represents a more gentle side of giants, showing they're not all violent and destructive. But many giants are aggressive, especially after centuries of being driven to the margins by wizards. If Voldemort's ideology of magical might-making right is renounced, what are giants supposed to do? They've been oppressed by wizards for generations. Voldemort offered them revenge and power. If he's no longer offering that, some giants might turn on him, seeing him as weak. Others might be open to a different path if there's a genuine offer of coexistence and respect. The Department of Mysteries would want to study Voldemort extensively if given the chance. The Unspeakables research the deepest mysteries of magic, love, death, time, space, thought. A person who was incapable of love due to the circumstances of their conception, who then somehow developed that capacity, would be an unprecedented phenomenon worthy of intense study. They'd want to understand the mechanism, what changed in his mind and magic and soul. They'd want to monitor him with every instrument they have, record every spell he casts, every thought he thinks if possible. Voldemort would likely hate this, being treated as a research subject, but it might be a condition of his freedom or reduced sentence. The Unspeakables might discover things that challenge their understanding of magic. Perhaps they'd find that love is even more fundamental to magic than previously thought. That it's not just one type of magic, but something woven into the fabric of magical reality itself. Perhaps they'd find that souls are more resilient than believed, that even terrible damage can heal under the right circumstances. Perhaps they'd find that consciousness and identity are mutable, that the person Voldemort is now is genuinely different from the person he was, measurably so in ways that can be magically detected. These discoveries would reshape magical theory. The prophecy about Harry and Voldemort would need to be reinterpreted. The prophecy said neither can live while the other survives, that one must die at the hand of the other. But prophecies are tricky things open to interpretation. If Voldemort fundamentally changes, is he still the person the prophecy was about? Has the Dark Lord died in a metaphorical sense, killed not by Harry's hand, but by love? The Department of Mysteries has an entire room of prophecies, and scholars spend their lives analyzing them. This particular prophecy, arguably the most significant in recent history, would be debated endlessly. Some would argue it's fulfilled, others that it's still hanging over both Harry and Voldemort, creating ongoing tension. Time turners, though heavily restricted, might theoretically be used to observe Voldemort's past and verify his account of events. Did he truly fall in love spontaneously, or was there magical interference? Was it a gradual process or a sudden change? Observers could watch from the protected confines of time travel and report back. However, this would be controversial. Using time turners carries risk, and some would argue that Voldemort's past should remain private, that constant surveillance, even retrospective surveillance, is a violation. The ethics of this would be hotly debated in the Wizengamot. St. Mungo's Hospital would be involved in assessing Voldemort's mental and physical state. Healers there treat everything from spell damage to creature-induced injuries to mental maladies caused by dark magic. They'd need to determine if Voldemort is genuinely experiencing emotions he couldn't before, or if something else is happening. Is it a curse? A potion? A mental break? The mind healers would want to examine him using legilimency, though Voldemort is a master occlumens who spent decades protecting his mind. He'd have to allow them in, make himself vulnerable, let them see his thoughts and feelings. That act of trust alone would be significant evidence of change. The healers might find that Voldemort's brain has literally changed. Magic affects physiology in the Harry Potter world. Dark magic corrupts the body and soul. Perhaps learning to love has had physical effects, neural pathways forming that weren't there before, regions of his brain lighting up that were dormant. This would be documented, studied, turned into case studies for future healers to learn from. Voldemort, who always prized his privacy and control, would become the most analyzed person in magical history. Every aspect of his transformation would be picked apart and examined. The wizarding economy would be affected by all of this uncertainty. When Voldemort was at large, economy suffered because people were afraid to spend, to invest, to plan for the future. If he changes and the war truly ends, there might be an economic boom as people feel safe again. But if there's ongoing controversy about his fate, ongoing trials and debates, the uncertainty continues. The Malfoys, who funded much of Voldemort's operation, would face financial scrutiny. Did they profit from his regime? Are they liable for damages? Should their fortune be seized and used to compensate victims? The economic ripples would affect everyone. Diagon Alley, Hogsmeade, and other magical commercial centers would slowly return to normal if the threat is truly gone. Shops that closed during the war would reopen. Families would feel safe shopping for school supplies again. The atmosphere would change from fear to cautious optimism to eventual normalcy. But there would always be memorials, always be reminders. Certain shops might never reopen because the owners were killed. Certain families would never return to these happy places because they hold too many painful memories. The physical spaces would bear the scars even as people try to move forward. Ollivander's wand shop faces an interesting situation. Ollivander knows every wand he's ever sold, remembers every customer. He sold Tom Riddle his wand, yew and phoenix feather, 13.5 inches. He was later captured and tortured by Voldemort for information about wands. If Voldemort is truly changed and free, would he return to Ollivander to apologize? To seek forgiveness? Ollivander is old and has seen much. Perhaps he'd be able to see past the horror to the person Tom might be becoming. Or perhaps the trauma of his captivity would make forgiveness impossible. Either way, a conversation between them would be emotionally intense and symbolically significant. Wand lore might also play a role in Voldemort's story. His wand chose him once, but does it still? If he's fundamentally different, would his wand reject him? Wands are sentient to a degree. They have loyalty and preferences. The brother wands, Voldemort's and Harry's, with cores from the same phoenix, connected in ways that affected both wizards. If Voldemort changes, does that magical connection with Harry also change? Can they perform magic near each other without the priori incantatem effect? These are practical questions with significant implications. The Weasley family would have particularly strong feelings about all of this. Fred died in the war against Voldemort. That loss scarred the family permanently. George, Fred's twin, has to live the rest of his life without his other half. Mrs. Weasley, who always protected her children fiercely, would struggle with the idea that Voldemort might be redeemed or forgiven. Mr. Weasley, who's more open-minded, might be willing to consider the possibility of change while still honoring his son's sacrifice. The family would be divided, each member processing grief differently, and Voldemort's fate would force them to confront those differences. Percy Weasley, who worked at the ministry and returned to fight in the final battle, would be involved in the administrative and legal aspects of dealing with Voldemort. Percy understands bureaucracy and law. He'd probably argue for a careful, systematic approach, proper trials and procedures, everything done by the book. But he'd also be remembering Fred, remembering the moment his brother died, and that personal pain would color his professional judgment no matter how hard he tried to be impartial. And Fleur would bring an interesting perspective, as they're connected to both the British and French magical communities. Fleur is part Vila, a magical creature, so she understands prejudice and being seen as other. She might have some sympathy for Voldemort's attempts to change, recognizing that society doesn't easily forgive those it's labeled as different or dangerous. Bill, who worked as a curse-breaker for Gringotts and was attacked by Fenrir Greyback, has experienced dark magic firsthand. He carries scars, both visible and invisible. His opinion would carry weight. Charlie Weasley, working with dragons in Romania, might seem disconnected from events, but he'd be called back for family discussions and major events. His experience with dangerous creatures that can't be fully tamed or trusted would influence how he views Voldemort. You can work with dragons, build relationships with them, but you never forget what they're capable of. You respect them while being cautious. That might be how he'd approach a changed Voldemort, cautiously willing to believe in change, while never being naive about the danger. Ginny Weasley has her own complicated history with Voldemort. She was possessed by his younger self through the diary Horcrux. She knows what it's like to have him in your head, controlling you, using you. If Voldemort tries to apologize to her for that violation, for using an 11-year-old girl as a tool, what could he possibly say? Ginny is strong and brave. She recovered and moved on, but that experience shaped her. She might be one of the people least able to accept his redemption because she knows intimately what he's capable of. She's felt his presence in her mind, and that kind of violation doesn't easily lead to forgiveness. Ron and Hermione, if they're together in this timeline, would work through their opinions together. Ron's instinct would be to reject any possibility of Voldemort changing. He's too dangerous. He's killed too many people, including some of Ron's family and friends. Hermione would approach it more analytically, wanting evidence, wanting to understand the mechanism of change. She'd read everything available about love magic, magical psychology, soul magic. But even her analytical approach would be tested by her emotional reactions. Hermione was tortured by Bellatrix Lestrange, one of Voldemort's most devoted followers. That trauma would make it hard to approach the subject dispassionately. Neville Longbottom has perhaps the strongest claim to hatred of Voldemort, even beyond Harry. His parents were tortured into insanity by Bellatrix and other Death Eaters on Voldemort's orders. They're alive but not really present, living in St. Mungo's, unable to recognize their son. Neville grew up without his parents because of Voldemort. He became a hero in his own right, killed Nagini, stood up to evil. But he did it all while carrying this terrible wound, this absence where his parents should be. If someone asked Neville whether Voldemort deserves a second chance, what could he say? His answer would be complicated by pain and loss that never fully heals. Luna Lovegood would have one of the most interesting perspectives. Luna sees the world differently than most people. She believes in things others don't. She's open to possibilities that seem absurd, and she's also surprisingly wise beneath her eccentric exterior. Luna might be able to accept that Voldemort could change because she doesn't believe in fixed categories of good and evil. She understands that people and creatures are complex. She also experienced loss. Her mother died in a magical accident, and she was imprisoned by Death Eaters. But her grief didn't make her bitter or closed-minded. She might be one of the few willing to give Voldemort a genuine chance while still being clear-eyed about who he was. The Malfoy family's situation would be incredibly complex. Lucius and Narcissa both served Voldemort, though Narcissa ultimately betrayed him to save Draco. Draco himself was branded with the Dark Mark as a teenager, forced into service, traumatized by what he witnessed and was asked to do. If Voldemort changes and starts advocating for different values, what does that mean for the Malfoys? Do they feel vindicated, relieved that the path they were on is being renounced? Or do they feel betrayed, like they sacrificed and suffered for nothing? Lucius, in particular, would struggle with this, having devoted years and fortune to a cause that's now being called a mistake. Draco's generation, the young people who were children during Voldemort's rise and return, would face unique challenges. They grew up in the shadow of this conflict. Some of them lost parents or siblings. Some of them were pressured to join the Death Eaters. Some of them fought in the Battle of Hogwarts before they were even adults. They're trying to build lives in a world still dealing with trauma and division. If Voldemort's story becomes about redemption rather than simple good versus evil, it complicates their understanding of their own experiences. Were the people they fought inherently evil, or were they misguided and broken? It's easier to move forward when things are clear-cut. The children born after the war, who only know Voldemort as a story, would have their own perspective. To them, he's a figure from their parents' generation, someone scary but not real in the way he was to people who lived through his reign. If he's redeemed or changes, he becomes a more ambiguous figure in their history lessons. They might be more willing to accept that people can change because they don't carry the personal trauma. This generational divide would create tension between those who remember and those who only know the stories. Magical creatures who served Voldemort or were affected by him would need consideration too. The Inferi, reanimated corpses under his control, were released from service when he fell, but creating them required dark magic and desecration of the dead. The families of people whose bodies were turned into Inferi would want answers, apologies, some form of recompense. How do you apologize for turning someone's loved one into a puppet? There's no adequate response to that kind of violation. Voldemort would have to attempt these conversations knowing they'll never be satisfactory, that some wounds are too deep to heal. The Lethifolds, Dementors, and other dark creatures Voldemort allied with or controlled would scatter without his leadership. Some might return to their natural habitats and behaviors. Others, particularly those who developed a taste for the chaos and violence of war, might continue causing problems. The Ministry would need to deal with these creatures, and if Voldemort is alive and changed, they might ask for his help. He knows how to communicate with these creatures, how to control or influence them. Would he help clean up the mess he made, even if it means using skills he gained during his darkest period? Nagini, Voldemort's snake and final Horcrux, was killed by Neville. But before she was a Horcrux, Nagini had her own story. In expanded Harry Potter lore, she was a woman cursed to become a snake. If Voldemort could look back on his relationship with Nagini after learning to love, he might realize he enslaved someone who was human once, who had thoughts and feelings and a life before he turned her into a tool and a vessel for part of his soul. That realization would be devastating. He can't make amends to Nagini, she's dead, but he can carry the weight of understanding what he did to her. The portraits of previous Hogwarts headmasters would all have opinions on Voldemort's situation. Phineas Nigellus Black, ancestor of Sirius, was a Slytherin headmaster who often took the side of pureblood families. He might surprisingly be sympathetic to Voldemort, seeing his fall into darkness as understandable given his background and circumstances. Other portraits might be harsher, particularly those who lived during periods when Hogwarts fought against dark wizards. The portrait gallery would be a chorus of historical perspectives, each former headmaster weighing in based on their own experiences and values. The castle of Hogwarts itself, which is somewhat sentient and certainly magical, might respond to Voldemort differently if he's changed. The castle famously defended itself during the final battle, animated suits of armor, and used protective enchantments. If Voldemort returned to the castle, would it still perceive him as a threat? Hogwarts is old magic, deep magic, connected to the founders. It might be able to sense whether someone means harm in ways that humans can't. The castle's response to Voldemort would be a kind of magical lie detector test, an indication of whether his change is genuine at a fundamental level. The Forbidden Forest has been mentioned, but it's worth exploring further. The forest is old, dark, and full of magic that predates Hogwarts. It's a place where natural law supersedes wizard law. Voldemort hid there when he was a wraith, a disembodied fragment of soul clinging to existence. If he returned as a changed man, the forest might remember him as the intruder, a presence that didn't belong. Or it might recognize that he's different now, that whatever made him anathema to natural magic has been healed. The forest doesn't forgive or judge in human terms, but it responds to the essential nature of things. Hogsmeade Village would be another place heavy with memory for Voldemort. He worked briefly at Borgin and Burke's after school, sold dark artifacts, began building his reputation. The shopkeepers there might remember him or remember stories about him. The village has defended itself against Death Eater attacks multiple times. If Voldemort walked down the main street, even changed and peaceful, people would recognize him. The response would be visceral and immediate. Some people would flee. Some would draw wands. Some might attack on sight, seeing only the man who terrorized them, unable to see past that identity to whatever he might have become. The Three Broomsticks and the Hog's Head, the two main pubs in Hogsmeade, would have their own histories with Voldemort's era. The Hog's Head was where Trelawney made the prophecy about Harry and Voldemort, overheard by a Death Eater spy. That moment set so much in motion, led to the deaths of Harry's parents, shaped the entire conflict. Aberforth Dumbledore, who runs the Hog's Head, lost his brother partly because of Voldemort. He's not the forgiving type. If Voldemort entered his pub, Aberforth would probably throw him out physically, changed or not. Some wounds and some losses don't lead to reconciliation. Madame Rosmerta at the Three Broomsticks was placed under the Imperious curse by Death Eaters and used as an unwilling agent. She has trauma from being controlled, from doing things against her will, from having her autonomy stripped away. Many people were victims of the Imperious curse during Voldemort's reign. Some never fully recovered psychologically. The violation of having your will overridden, your body moving and speaking but not by your choice, is profound. Voldemort would need to acknowledge these violations too, the countless people who were turned into puppets, and there's no apology adequate for that. The Shrieking Shack, infamous as the most haunted building in Britain, was where Voldemort killed Snape. Snape bled out on the floor of that dusty shack, giving his memories to Harry with his last breaths, revealing decades of complicated loyalty and love. If Voldemort has learned to understand love, to value it, then his murder of Snape takes on new meaning. Snape died for love of Lily Potter. Every action he took for years was motivated by that love. Voldemort killed him casually, not understanding that he was destroying someone who embodied the very thing Voldemort now supposedly values. That realization would be another weight on his conscience. The graveyard in Little Hangleton, where Voldemort was resurrected, would be a place of terrible significance. He used his father's bone in the resurrection ritual, defiling his grave. Tom Riddle Sr.'s entire life was manipulated by Merope's love potion. Then he abandoned her. Then his remains were used in dark magic. That family is tragic in every direction. The Riddle house, where the elderly gardener Frank Bryce was murdered in cold blood for no reason except being in the wrong place, stands empty and avoided. These physical locations carry the psychic weight of Voldemort's crimes. They'd need to be dealt with somehow, either memorialized or cleansed or destroyed. The Gaunt family shack, where Voldemort's mother grew up in poverty and abuse, would be another location to consider. Merope Gaunt was desperate and lonely when she used a love potion on Tom Riddle Sr. Her actions were wrong, but she was also a victim of her father's cruelty and society's prejudice. If Voldemort traces his inability to love back to his conception, he'd need to grapple with his mother's story. She died giving birth to him, alone and powerless, hoping he'd be loved even though she couldn't stay to love him herself. That tragedy is part of his origin, and understanding it might help him understand himself. The orphanage where Voldemort grew up no longer exists in the timeline, but the location does. He terrorized other children there, showed his magical power in cruel ways, was already displaying signs of what he'd become. The matron, Mrs. Cole, recognized there was something wrong with him, something off. She was scared of him even when he was a child. If Voldemort could somehow speak to the other orphans he grew up with, the ones who survived and grew into adults living Muggle lives, what would they say? Do they remember him? Do they still have nightmares about the strange boy who could make bad things happen? His capacity for cruelty started so young, before Hogwarts, before he fully understood what he was. Wool's orphanage represents Voldemort's complete lack of love from the very beginning. He had no parents, no family, no one who cared about him personally. The orphanage staff saw him as difficult and disturbing. The other children feared him. He grew up in an environment completely devoid of affection or warmth. That doesn't excuse his choices, but it contextualizes them. A child who never experiences love doesn't learn empathy or connection. They learn that the world is hostile, and that power is the only thing that matters. Breaking that foundational understanding as an adult would require completely rewiring his basic assumptions about reality and relationships. The Chamber of Secrets, which Voldemort opened as a student and again through Ginny Weasley, would need to be dealt with permanently. The basilisk is dead, killed by Harry, but the chamber itself remains, a monument to Salazar Slytherin's prejudice and to Voldemort's first major act of violence as a student. He killed Moaning Myrtle, let Hagrid take the blame, and felt no remorse. The chamber could be sealed forever, or it could be transformed into something else, maybe a memorial to Myrtle and other victims of prejudice and violence. That transformation from a place of death to a place of remembrance would be symbolically important. The cave where Voldemort hid the locket Horcrux, forcing orphans there as a child and later using it to torture Kreacher and create deadly protections, is another site of horror. Dumbledore was weakened fatally by the potion there. The cave was designed to be a place of maximum suffering. If Voldemort is changed, he might offer to guide people there, to dismantle the remaining protections, to make the place safe. But going back to these sites of his crimes, confronting physically what he did, would be psychologically difficult, even for a changed person. Each location would trigger memories and force him to relive his actions. The Ministry of Magic building itself was infiltrated and controlled by Voldemort's regime. Death Eaters walked the halls openly. Muggleborns were persecuted through official channels. The Ministry became an instrument of terror. Purging that corruption, rebuilding trust in magical government, would take years. If Voldemort testified about how he corrupted the Ministry, what blackmail and threats and murders were used to control officials, it would reveal the extent of the rot. Some Ministry workers collaborated willingly, true believers in his ideology. Others were coerced, threatened with harm to their families. Sorting out who did what and why would be a massive undertaking. The Department of Mysteries mentioned before contains rooms dedicated to fundamental forces: time, space, death, love, thought. Voldemort was obsessed with conquering death but ignored or dismissed love. The love room in the department is kept locked and only certain people can enter it safely. There's a suggestion that the power inside is both beautiful and terrible, that love is more dangerous and powerful than most wizards realize. If Voldemort is brought to the department for study, would they try to bring him to the love room? Would he be able to enter, or would whatever forces inside reject him, or would it embrace him, recognizing that he's finally capable of what's kept in that room? The death room, where the veil stands that Sirius Black fell through, represents the mystery and finality of death. Voldemort spent his life trying to escape death, seeing it as the ultimate enemy. But the veil suggests there's something beyond death, something unknown, but not necessarily terrible. Those who've accepted death can hear voices beyond the veil, voices of people they've lost. If a changed Voldemort stood before the veil, having accepted his mortality, would he hear anything? Would his mother's voice call to him, the woman who died giving him life? Would the voices of his victims accuse him? The veil doesn't judge or explain, it just is. And facing it would require Voldemort to confront the thing he's feared most his entire life. The Prophecy Hall, where countless predictions are stored in glass spheres, contains the prophecy about Harry and Voldemort. It's broken now, destroyed in the fight between Harry's friends and Death Eaters. But the record exists, the words are known. The prophecy created a self-fulfilling situation. Voldemort heard about it, tried to prevent it, and by trying to kill Harry as a baby, he marked Harry as his equal and created the very enemy the prophecy described. If Voldemort has learned to value life and love differently, he might see the prophecy not as a threat, but as a tragedy that could have been avoided if he'd made different choices. The Brain Room, where thoughts and intelligence are studied, would want to examine Voldemort's transformation from a cognitive perspective. How does the brain of someone incapable of love differ from a normal brain? What changes when they develop that capacity? Are there magical markers in neural tissue that correspond to emotional capacity? The brains kept in tanks for study in that room are mysterious and somewhat disturbing, but they represent an attempt to understand consciousness and thought. Voldemort's unique situation would provide unprecedented research opportunities, though again, he'd have to consent to being studied like a specimen. The Time Room, with its bell jar showing life and death in a cycle, would offer another philosophical framework for understanding Voldemort's story. The jar contains an egg that hatches into a bird, which ages and becomes an egg again, endlessly cycling. It suggests that endings and beginnings are connected. that death and birth are part of the same process, that transformation is constant. Voldemort tried to break out of this cycle through Horcruxes, to make himself static and unchanging. But learning to love might mean accepting the cycle, accepting that he's part of the natural flow of existence, not separate from it or above it. The Hall of Prophecy, even with his specific prophecy destroyed, would be a reminder that the future is never certain. Prophecies can be misinterpreted, ignored, or self-fulfilled through the actions we take in response to them. Voldemort's story might suggest that destiny is mutable, that we're not locked into being one thing forever, that even the darkest prophecy can be circumvented through choices. But it also suggests that some consequences are inescapable, that actions have costs that compound over time, that you can't simply restart and avoid what you've already done. Azkaban Fortress deserves more exploration because it would likely be where Voldemort is held if he's not executed. The fortress is on an island in the North Sea, isolated and forbidding. Before the Dementors were removed, it was a place of absolute despair. Even without Dementors, it's designed to break people down, to remove hope. Prisoners live in cells with minimal human contact, reliving their worst memories over and over. For someone like Voldemort, who's committed thousands of crimes, the mental weight would be staggering. Every murder, every torture session, every life he destroyed would cycle through his mind with nothing to distract from them. The guards at Azkaban would be wizards and witches who'd probably lost someone to Voldemort or his Death Eaters. They'd know exactly who they're guarding. The temptation to make his imprisonment harsher than legally allowed would be strong. They might forget to bring meals on time or deliver them cold. They might neglect repairs in his cell. They might speak loudly about the people he killed, making sure he hears about the families destroyed, the children orphaned, the lives ruined. These small cruelties would violate his rights as a prisoner, but who would punish guards for being harsh to Voldemort? The oversight would need to be strict to prevent abuse, even abuse of someone who's abused so many others. If the person Voldemort loves is allowed to visit him in Azkaban, those visits would be heartbreaking. They'd sit across from each other in a visiting room, probably separated by magical barriers that prevent physical contact. They'd have limited time to talk, always supervised, never private. She'd see him slowly deteriorating under the weight of isolation and guilt. He'd see her living her life outside, aging, potentially moving on, and have to accept that she deserves better than waiting for someone who might never be free. These visits might sustain him or might make imprisonment harder, a constant reminder of what he can't have. The other prisoners in Azkaban would have varied reactions to Voldemort's presence. Some Death Eaters who remained loyal would be thrilled, possibly planning escapes or rebellions to free him. Others who feel betrayed by his change would hate him more than the Aurors do. Non-Death Eater prisoners, people imprisoned for other crimes, would likely be terrified. Voldemort is the most dangerous wizard alive. Even without a wand, even claiming to have changed, he'd be feared. The prison politics would be complex and violent, and Voldemort would need to navigate them while trying to remain true to his claimed transformation. Escaping Azkaban would be tempting. Voldemort has done it before, helped others escape. He knows the weaknesses in the prison's defenses. If he's truly changed, he'd need to resist that temptation constantly. Every day would be a choice to stay, to accept his punishment, to trust that serving his time is the right thing, even though he could potentially leave. That ongoing choice, repeated day after day in miserable conditions, would demonstrate whether his change is real more than any trial testimony or magical test could. The Wizengamot trials would be public, broadcast magically for wizards worldwide to observe. Every session would be analyzed endlessly. Legal experts would debate fine points of magical law. Ethicists would discuss whether someone fundamentally changed is still responsible for past actions. Religious and philosophical leaders from various magical traditions would weigh in on redemption and forgiveness. The trials would become a focal point for society to process trauma, argue about values, and decide what kind of world they want to build moving forward. Voldemort would be at the center, but it wouldn't really be about him. It would be about everyone else working through their pain and fear. Witness testimony would be devastating. Person after person would take the stand, describe what Voldemort or his Death Eaters did to them or their loved ones. Some witnesses would be composed, giving factual accounts. Others would break down, the trauma still too raw. Some would scream at Voldemort, demanding answers, demanding to know why. And what could he say? Even if he's genuinely changed, Even if he feels remorse, no explanation would satisfy someone whose child was murdered or whose spouse was tortured. The reasons wouldn't matter to them. The outcome is all that matters, and the outcome is loss that can never be restored. The defense, if Voldemort even has one, would have an impossible job. How do you defend someone who's committed atrocities but claims to have changed? The defense couldn't argue innocence. The crimes are too well documented. They couldn't argue he was controlled or coerced. He was the one doing the controlling. They could only argue for mercy based on his transformation, presenting evidence of change and asking the court to consider rehabilitation over punishment. But that argument rings hollow when the victims are sitting in the courtroom, living with permanent scars, physical and emotional, unable to move forward because the person who hurt them might be released. The prosecution would have extensive evidence. Memories extracted and preserved in pensieves, testimony from surviving victims, documentation of orders given and murders committed, artifacts used in dark magic. They'd build a case so comprehensive that even Voldemort couldn't deny the extent of his crimes. The prosecutor would probably argue that some crimes are beyond redemption, that society needs to draw lines, that allowing Voldemort to live or potentially go free would be a betrayal of every victim and would send a dangerous message that you can do anything and escape consequences if you claim to have changed later. The jury, assuming there is one, would be carefully selected. They'd need to be people who could be impartial, but in the wizarding world of Britain, almost everyone was affected by Voldemort in some way. Finding 12 people who don't have a personal connection to the conflict would be nearly impossible. The jury might need to come from other countries, magical communities not directly involved in the British Wars, but that would raise questions about whether outsiders can truly understand what was endured and what justice requires in this context. The verdict, whatever it is, would set precedent for centuries. Future dark wizards would be judged against Voldemort. If he's shown mercy, that mercy becomes a possibility for others. If he's executed or imprisoned forever, that sends a message that some lines can't be crossed without permanent consequences. The magical world would be defining its values through how it treats its worst enemy. That's a heavy burden to place on a legal proceeding, but it's unavoidable given Voldemort's significance. After the trial, assuming Voldemort survives, his daily existence would be the real test. Grand gestures are easier than the mundane work of being a different person day after day, waking up each morning with the weight of your crimes, eating meals while thinking about people who'll never eat again because of you, seeing sunlight and knowing others are in darkness because of what you did. The slow, grinding nature of living with guilt and trying to be better when better will never be good enough, that's the real challenge of redemption. The person Voldemort loves would face their own slow grind. They'd deal with harassment from people who think they're a traitor or a fool. They'd struggle with their own doubts in quiet moments, wondering if they're right to believe he's changed. They'd face practical difficulties, maybe losing their job because their employer doesn't want the controversy, maybe being shunned by friends and family who can't understand why they'd stay with someone like that. Love sustains them, but love alone isn't always enough when the entire world is against you and the person you love. Their relationship would be tested in ways most couples never experience. Can you love someone knowing they've done terrible things? Can you reconcile the person you see in private moments, gentle and remorseful and trying, with the person who committed atrocities? Can you trust that they won't revert, that the change is permanent, that you're safe? These questions would never fully go away. Every argument, every moment of tension would carry the shadow of what he's capable of. Building trust would be a constant process, not something that's ever fully completed. Children, if they had them, would be complicated. Bringing a child into this situation would be controversial at best, irresponsible at worst. The child would carry Voldemort's legacy, grow up knowing their father is one of the most hated people in history. They'd face bullying, discrimination, constant judgment. But they'd also potentially have a father who's learned from his mistakes, who's determined to raise them with love, who wants to break the cycle of lovelessness that created him. That child's life would be difficult, but they might also represent hope, a new generation not defined by the past. The magical community would watch that child obsessively. Is there darkness in them? Do they show signs of their father's cruelty? Or are they normal, proof that children aren't doomed by their parents' actions? The pressure on the child would be immense, every action scrutinized, every childhood mistake interpreted as evidence of dark tendencies, or, conversely, as proof of redemption's possibility. Growing up under that microscope would be psychologically damaging, even with loving parents trying to shield them. Education for that child would be a challenge. Could they attend Hogwarts, or would the school refuse admission, not wanting the controversy and potential danger? Would other parents pull their children out rather than let them attend school with Voldemort's child? Homeschooling might be the only option, which would isolate the child further, prevent them from forming normal social bonds and friendships. Every aspect of growing up would be affected by their father's identity and history. The extended family situation would be non-existent on Voldemort's side. The Riddles are all dead. The Gaunts are all dead. He has no living relatives, no grandparents or aunts or uncles for his child to know. On the other side, the person he loves might have family, and they'd have to decide whether to maintain those relationships. Can you bring your child to grandmother's house for holidays when grandmother refuses to acknowledge your partner's existence? Can you celebrate family occasions knowing your father isn't welcome? These practical, painful questions would come up constantly. The child might grow up to resent both parents, the father for his past and the mother for choosing to stay with him, or they might become a fierce advocate for second chances and redemption, using their own story to argue that people can change and that children shouldn't be judged for their parents' actions. Either way, their life would be defined by circumstances they didn't choose, a burden no child should have to carry, but one they'd have no choice about. As decades pass and Voldemort ages, assuming he's mortal again after destroying his Horcruxes, the nature of the question changes. It's no longer about whether he deserves punishment or redemption in principle. It becomes about a specific old man who's lived with guilt for years, who's tried to make amends in whatever limited ways were possible, who's possibly done some good to balance the scales slightly. Do you continue punishing someone who served their time, who's genuinely different, who poses no threat? At what point does vengeance become cruelty, or does that point ever arrive for someone whose crimes were so extreme? The death of Voldemort, assuming it's natural rather than execution, would be a significant moment. Would people celebrate? Would they mourn? Would they feel relieved that he's finally gone and can never come back? The funeral would be controversial, assuming there is one. Who would attend? The person he loved would be there, probably alone or with their children if they had any. Maybe Luna Lovegood would come, because she's kind enough to think everyone deserves someone at their funeral. Maybe Harry Potter would come, because he understands better than anyone the complicated legacy of Voldemort and his own connection to it. The eulogy, if there is one, would be nearly impossible to write. How do you summarize a life like that? Do you focus on the crimes and the horror? Do you acknowledge the late change and the attempt at redemption? Do you speak about the waste of potential, the tragedy of what he could have been if things had been different? Probably all of those things would need to be mentioned, and still the eulogy wouldn't capture the full complexity of who he was and what he represented. The burial site would be controversial. He probably couldn't be buried in a normal wizard cemetery. People would vandalize the grave. Maybe he'd need to be buried in an unmarked location, or cremated with ashes scattered in secret. Or maybe, if enough time had passed and enough healing had occurred, he could be buried somewhere with a simple stone that acknowledges both who he was and who he tried to become. The grave marker might read simply, Tom Marvolo Riddle, with dates, letting history be history, without celebration or condemnation. After his death, the debates would continue. Historians would write books arguing different interpretations of his life and what his late change meant. Some would maintain he never truly changed, that it was manipulation until the end. Others would argue his transformation was genuine and significant, a proof of love's power and the possibility of redemption. Still others would land somewhere in the middle, acknowledging complexity and avoiding simple judgments. His life would be studied in schools, debated in academic journals, referenced in discussions of morality and justice for centuries. The person who loved him would live on, carrying memories of two different people in one body, the monster and the man who tried to be better. Their grief would be complicated, mixed with relief and guilt and sadness and probably some anger too. They'd spend their remaining years trying to preserve some truth about him that others might not see. Writing memoirs maybe, giving interviews to historians, wanting people to understand that he was more complicated than either the simple villain or the redemption story. They'd want the full truth told, with all its messiness and contradiction. Their children would grow up with this legacy, and eventually they'd have to decide what to do with it. Do they embrace their father's history, talk about it openly, try to educate others? Do they reject it entirely, change their names, Move away, build lives disconnected from his shadow? Do they work in fields related to his crimes, maybe becoming healers or aurors or working with victims of dark magic, trying to repair in small ways what he destroyed? Each child would make their own choice, and those choices would be their own journey of coming to terms with their inheritance. The magical world would eventually move past Voldemort as immediate memory fades into history. New threats would emerge, new dark wizards who need to be stopped, new conflicts that divide the community. Voldemort would become a case study, a cautionary tale, a historical figure rather than a living memory. But the questions his life raised, about evil and redemption, about love and change, about justice and mercy, those questions would remain relevant because they're fundamental to human nature and society, magical or otherwise. The final assessment of whether Voldemort falling in love was redemptive or tragic would probably be both. Both at the same time, inseparably intertwined. It's tragic that he only learned to love after destroying so many lives, after it was too late to undo the harm, after he'd already gone so far down a dark path that coming back would be agonizingly difficult. It's tragic that his victims never got to see him learn this lesson before he hurt them, that knowing he eventually changed wouldn't heal their wounds or bring back their loved ones. But it's also redemptive in the sense that it demonstrates love is indeed powerful enough to reach anyone, that no one is completely beyond change, that even the darkest heart can crack open and let light in under the right circumstances. It's redemptive that the person he loved was willing to see him as more than his worst actions, to believe in his capacity for growth, to stay when staying was hard. It's redemptive that he chose, however late, to face what he'd done rather than continuing to run from it, to accept consequences rather than fighting them, to try to be better even when better would never be good enough. In the end, the story of Voldemort falling in love would be less about him specifically and more about the broader human condition. We all contain the capacity for both great good and terrible evil. We all make choices that shape who we become. We all have opportunities to change or to remain stuck in patterns that harm ourselves and others. Most of us will never face choices as stark or extreme as Voldemort's, but we all face smaller versions of the same questions. Do we choose power or connection? Do we choose fear or love? Do we choose to see others as tools or as people who matter as much as we do? The transformation would be incomplete and imperfect, because that's the nature of change. We don't flip a switch and become different people. We take small steps, make better choices one day at a time, backslide sometimes, struggle constantly with who we were and who we're trying to be. Voldemort's journey toward becoming capable of love and choosing to act on it despite the cost would be messy and difficult and full of setbacks, because that's what real change looks like. The fairy tale version where love conquers all instantly and completely isn't true. The real version is much harder and much more interesting. The person who loved him would also be changed by the experience, probably not entirely for the better. You can't love someone with that much darkness in their past without being affected by it, without taking on some of the weight, without developing your own scars and struggles. They'd grow in some ways, become more empathetic and understanding of complexity, but they'd also possibly become more cynical, more aware of how evil people can be, more haunted by the stories and memories they couldn't avoid learning about. Love costs something when the beloved is someone like Voldemort, and they'd pay that price every day. The children of such a union would carry forward the complicated legacy, and through them perhaps some kind of healing could eventually occur. They'd be living bridges between the past and the future, carrying both the darkness of their father's history and the light of their parents' love and their own choices. They might be proof that we're not bound by our parents' sins, that each generation has the opportunity to choose differently, to build something new rather than perpetuating old cycles of harm. The broader magical community would be forever changed by having to grapple with these questions in a real, immediate way, rather than as abstract philosophy. They'd have to decide what kind of society they want to be, how they balance justice and mercy, how they treat their worst enemies, how they respond to claims of redemption. These decisions would shape magical law and culture for generations, establishing precedents and norms that would affect how future crimes are handled and how future villains are treated. In some distant future, when everyone who directly experienced Voldemort's reign is dead, when the emotional immediacy has faded into historical distance, his story would probably be taught very differently. It would be analyzed academically, debated philosophically, referenced as a turning point in magical history. Students would write essays about the nature of evil and redemption, using him as their primary example. The raw pain and rage and fear that dominated the immediate aftermath would be replaced by something more measured, though hopefully not so measured that the horror of his crimes is minimized or forgotten. The ultimate lesson might be that love is powerful enough to change anyone, but that change doesn't erase consequences, doesn't undo harm, doesn't automatically earn forgiveness. Love is transformative, but not magical in the sense of making everything better instantly. It's a force that makes change possible, that creates the conditions for growth and redemption, but the work still has to be done. The consequences still have to be faced, and the people harmed still get to decide whether forgiveness is possible or appropriate. That's a complicated lesson, not a simple moral. And that complexity is probably the most honest and useful way to approach questions of evil and redemption in real life, as well as in stories. So what if Lord Voldemort fell in love? He'd discover that love doesn't save you from yourself. It just gives you a reason to save yourself and makes the work of doing so possible. He'd learn that being capable of love means being capable of real remorse, and remorse for the crimes he committed would be a burden almost too heavy to bear. He'd find that the person who loves him pays a price for that love, faces judgment and isolation and doubt. He'd realize that changing doesn't erase the past or make victims forgive or guarantee happiness. He'd understand, finally, that love is the most powerful magic, not because it makes everything perfect, but because it makes meaning possible. Connection, real, and the hard work of becoming better worthwhile even when it's painful and difficult and incomplete. And that understanding, though it comes too late to undo the harm he's done, might be the most profound transformation of all.